Hello, and welcome to part 1 of Istio Deep Dive. My name is Andres, and today I will be doing an introduction to debugging and troubleshooting Istio. I will be working hands-on with Istio as we go along. This is an advanced topic, and assumes that you already have some basic understanding of Istio. I am going to be focusing on Istio, but I will also be talking about Envoy, which is the proxy that provides the data plane. When we talk about the Istio sidecar container, we're basically talking about Envoy. Understanding how Istio and Envoy work together can help you properly design your service mesh, as well as troubleshoot any issues that might arise. We're going to start talking a little bit about the APIs that are used to configure Envoy. They are called the XDS APIs, and they are a collection of different APIs to configure the different elements that make up the Envoy configuration. So for example, we have the Listener Discovery Service, LDS, which defines which ports to open on the proxy. We have the Route Discovery Service, which defines the route for each of the listeners. We have the Cluster Discovery Service, which defines the upstream clusters. Upstream clusters are the services that are actually going to process the requests that go through the Envoy proxy. We have the Envoy Endpoint Discovery Service, which defines the endpoints that are used to access each of the clusters, for example, the IPs, the DNS names, and so on. And we also have the Aggregate Discovery Service, which we're going to dig into a little bit more. All right, so the Aggregate Discovery Service encapsulates all of the resource types into a single gRPC stream. It allows ordering and prevents race conditions. The traditional XDS APIs are eventually consistent, which means that if they come in the wrong order, it could lead to a broken configuration. For example, if we define a route that points to a cluster that hasn't been configured yet, we could end up with a broken configuration. And just to make it clear, Istio uses ADS to configure the Envoy proxies. Okay, let's take a look at a running service mesh. I have a pod running here that has this sidecar container. Let's take a look. So if you see here, this particular pod has two containers. One of the containers is the Istio sidecar. The other container is the actual container that I defined. So let's see exactly what's running inside of my sidecar container. And the name of the sidecar container is Istio proxy. So we just run ps to see what processes are running. We have the pilot agent, which allows communication to Istio pilot. If you don't remember, pilot is the component of Istio that configures the proxies that run in the sidecars and that run in the gateways. And then we have the Envoy proxy itself. Now, if we see here, we can see that Envoy was started with a bootstrap configuration at this particular location. So let's go ahead and examine the Envoy bootstrap configuration. So we're going to use cat to be able to see what's inside of that file. And what we have here, we have a lot of metadata. At the top, we have things like the Istio version, things like that. Now keep in mind that in my next video I'm going to go into a lot more detail into the Envoy configuration, but for now, this is just a quick overview of the configuration. We have the runtime configuration, which specifies how the configuration is accessed. We keep scrolling down. We have a lot of the statistics that are going to be reported back, things like the response code and so on. Let's keep scrolling down. We have the configuration of the admin console, which is running in port 15,000. We'll keep that in mind because we'll use it a little bit later. We have the configuration of the resources, for example, the listener discovery service and the cluster discovery service, and both of these are configured to pull the configuration from ADS. So basically, instead of using LDS, all of that configuration is going to come through that single gRPC stream that is provided by ADS. We have the configuration for ADS, which, if you remember, stands for Aggregate Discovery Service. And this one is configured to fetch the configuration from a cluster, which is called XDS gRPC. So somewhere in here, we're going to have a static cluster configuration that is going to allow us to establish this gRPC stream and fetch all of the configurations for the listeners, the clusters, the routes, and so on. So here's the configuration for the XDS gRPC cluster. And if we see here, for the endpoint, what we're using a pipe. And this pipe is provided by the pilot agent that is also running inside of this container. Okay, and keep in mind that this is only the bootstrap configuration. This is going to be different from the actual runtime configuration of Envoy. The runtime configuration is basically the end result of all of the work that Istio does. So let's take a look at what that configuration looks like exactly. So to do that, one way is to actually hit the Envoy admin API directly. We can do that using curl by hitting the port 15,000. We can get, for example, all of the clusters, and we want to get them using JSON format. So what we see here is the actual running configuration of Envoy, which is going to have a lot more than what we were looking in the bootstrap configuration in the file system. What this means is that when you are trying to examine what configuration Envoy has, you're not going to find that configuration on the file system. You're going to either have to get it through this mechanism or some of the other mechanisms that Istio provides. So in here, we see a lot of different clusters that are not configured in the bootstrap configuration file. For example, this one, which is an outbound cluster. Obviously, this is a very low-level way of accessing the configuration, so let's take a look at what else Istio provides. If you have the istioctl binary in your path, which is something that I recommend, you can use it to examine the status of the proxies. For example, using proxy status, we can take a look at all of the proxies that are configured in our service mesh. The one we were looking at right now was sleep.sp. sp is the name of the namespace in which my pod is configured. And in here we can see that the clusters are synced. We can see that the listeners are synced, the endpoints, the routes are synced. We can also see the version of the particular proxy that is running in this sidecar, and so on. We can also get more detailed information, for example, about listeners. So something like istioctl, proxy config, listeners, and the name of the proxy, which in this case would be sleep.sp. Basically the same name that we have here. It should give us a list of all of the listeners that are configured at runtime for my proxy. We can also get a configuration dump for a particular listener, for example. If I specify one of the ports, let's do port 15001. I want to see the configuration in JSON. In here I can see just the snippet of configuration for this particular listener. I can see all of the filters, filter chains, the name of the listener, and so on. And we can use the same pattern to look at other configuration resources. For example, the routes, the clusters, and the endpoints. Okay, let's do a quick recap of some of the commands that we used throughout this video. As I mentioned before, the Envoy proxy that is running inside of the Istio sidecar container exposes all of the XDS APIs. So we can use something like curl to access the APIs directly. Of course, that is not very user-friendly. So if we want something a little bit more user-friendly, we can use the istioctl command. For example, we can use it to list all of the listeners for a particular proxy. We can also use it to get a configuration dump of a particular listener in a particular proxy. We can also use the same pattern for the other Envoy configuration elements, such as the routes, the clusters, and the endpoints. In the next video in this series, I'm going to go into more detail regarding how Istio and Envoy provide the data plane for your service mesh. I'm going to explain in a lot more detail how the Envoy configuration elements work, and we're going to take a look into how the Istio configuration is translated into the Envoy configuration. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, there's my handle. Thank you.